James was the kind of man most people didn't notice when they walked into the tall glass building downtown. He wore the same dark blue janitor's uniform every day, the one with his name stitched in white letters across the pocket. His shoes were old but always polished, and his hands, though rough and calloused, were steady when he pushed his mop across the marble floor. Every morning before sunrise, James arrived quietly, carrying a small lunchbox and a thermos of coffee. By the time the office workers began rushing in with their briefcases and laptops, James had already been working for hours, sweeping away dust, polishing the floors, and emptying the trash bins. To many people in the building, James was invisible. They passed him in the hallways without a word, sometimes without even making eye contact. A few would nod politely, but most were too busy, too caught up in meetings, deadlines, and phone calls to pay much attention to the man cleaning up after them. James never complained. He had grown used to this quiet kind of life. He was thankful for steady work, even if it meant being overlooked. What the others didn't know, however, was that James carried a whole world of music inside him. Long before he became a janitor, when he was just a little boy growing up in a small southern town, James had learned to play the piano at his local church. His mother, a kind woman who loved to sing hymns while she cooked, used to sit beside him on the bench as he tapped clumsy notes with his tiny fingers. She would hum softly, correcting him with patience, until his hands learned to flow across the keys like water in a stream. By the time James was a teenager, he could play with such beauty that neighbors would gather outside the church windows just to listen. But life, as it often does, had different plans. James's family didn't have money for music schools or grand opportunities. When his father grew ill, James took jobs wherever he could to help support the household. Dreams of playing on a big stage slowly faded into the background. The piano, once his constant companion, became a luxury he could no longer afford to chase. Over the years, his hands grew more familiar with brooms and buckets than with keys and melodies. Still, the music never left him. Sometimes, late at night after finishing his shift, James would stop by the old piano tucked away in the corner of the building's lobby. Most people never noticed it. The piano sat quietly, collecting dust, a leftover decoration from some long-forgotten holiday party. On evenings when no one was around, James would sit at the bench, place his fingers gently on the keys, and let the music spill out. It was his private moment, his secret way of keeping that part of himself alive. One sunny afternoon, the company where James worked decided to hold a small gathering in the lobby. It was meant to be casual, just a chance for the employees to relax, eat snacks, and chat with each other after a long week. The lobby buzzed with laughter and conversation as people sipped soda from plastic cups and nibbled on cookies arranged neatly on silver trays. James was in the background, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies, ready to pick up any crumbs or spills that might follow. Someone noticed the dusty piano in the corner. A young employee, curious and playful, pointed at it and joked, "Hey, maybe we should get some music going. Does anyone here even know how to play?" The group chuckled, glancing around, but no one stepped forward. Most were too shy or simply uninterested. That's when another voice chimed in, half teasing, "What about James? I bet he can give us a tune." The comment was met with light laughter. It wasn't meant to be cruel, but it carried the kind of tone that suggested no one really expected anything special to happen. People turned their heads toward James, who stood a few steps away, holding his mop handle like a walking stick. He froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. His heart gave a little jump. It had been years since he had played in front of anyone. Some of the employees clapped their hands encouragingly, though their smiles suggested more amusement than genuine faith. James shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing at the piano, then back at the group. For a second, he considered shaking his head and walking away. After all, he was just the janitor. His job was to keep the floors shiny, not to entertain the staff. But then, deep inside, a small spark flickered. Perhaps it was the same spark that once made him dream of stages and spotlights. James set down his mop slowly, wiping his hands on his uniform. He walked toward the piano with a quiet dignity, each step deliberate, as though he were carrying something heavy in his heart. The chatter in the lobby grew softer. A few people nudged each other, grinning, expecting a few clumsy notes or perhaps a funny attempt at a children's song. James pulled out the wooden bench and sat down. The seat felt both familiar and strange, like greeting an old friend after many years. He placed his fingers gently on the keys but did not press them right away. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply, letting the noise of the room fade into the background. Memories came rushing back: his mother's humming voice, the warmth of the church on a Sunday morning, the sound of neighbors clapping through open windows. The lobby waited. Some workers whispered. The CEO, who had come down for the gathering, stood quietly in the back, watching the janitor at the piano with mild curiosity. No one expected anything extraordinary. In their minds, this was just a passing moment, a small distraction before the snacks were finished and the conversations resumed. But James knew differently. For him, sitting at the piano was not a joke, not entertainment, not just something to pass the time. It was a piece of himself he had hidden away for decades, something he had never truly let go of. His fingers trembled slightly as he prepared to play, but deep inside, he felt a calmness spreading, as if the piano itself was reminding him, "You still belong here." And then, with one gentle press of a key, the room would change forever. James sat on the wooden bench, his back straight but his hands resting stiffly on his lap. The piano keys lay in front of him, a row of white and black that seemed both welcoming and frightening at the same time. For years he had played in secret, only when no one was watching. Now, dozens of eyes were fixed on him. He could feel their curiosity, their amusement, and even a little doubt hanging in the air. The sound of voices filled the lobby: soft laughter, a cough here and there, the shifting of feet as people leaned against the wall or crossed their arms. James's palms grew damp. His fingers hovered above the keys but didn't touch them. He thought about standing up, smiling politely, and saying, "I can't, not today." That would be easy. It would save him from embarrassment. After all, he wasn't hired to play music. He was just the janitor. Inside his chest, his heart beat louder than the voices around him. He hadn't played in front of people for so long, not since he was a young man. What if his fingers slipped? What if he forgot the notes? What if he made a fool of himself? The thought of failure pressed on him heavily. He imagined the laughter that might follow, the awkward claps, the quick return to snacks and conversations as if nothing happened. That picture alone nearly made him stand up and walk away. But another picture, softer and brighter, filled his mind too. He remembered sitting in the small church as a boy, his mother beside him, gently correcting his posture and encouraging him to try again. He remembered how people used to smile when he played, how they closed their eyes and let the music carry them somewhere far away from their worries. He remembered the joy of creating something beautiful with his hands, something that no job title could take away. James shifted slightly on the bench. His rough hands, so used to scrubbing floors and carrying trash bags, seemed out of place on the smooth piano keys. He flexed his fingers, testing the feel, but still, he hesitated. "Come on, James," someone called out playfully from the crowd. "Just give us a little tune. Anything will do." The room chuckled, not unkindly, but not with much faith either. They expected a quick joke, maybe a few wrong notes, something to make the moment lighter. Their expectations felt like a weight pressing down on James's shoulders. He glanced at the crowd. Some were smiling politely, some whispering to each other, and some looking down at their phones, only half paying attention. Near the back, the CEO stood with arms crossed, a neutral expression on his face. James looked back at the keys, his reflection faintly visible in the glossy surface. He whispered to himself, so softly no one could hear, Just one note. Just one. Still, he waited. His chest tightened as the silence stretched on. People began to shift impatiently. A few laughed quietly, as if the whole thing had been a silly idea after all. James felt his cheeks warm. The temptation to walk away returned stronger than before. Then, as he sat there, he remembered something else, something his mother used to say whenever he doubted himself. "James, the gift you've been given isn't just for you. It's for others. Don't hide it away." Those words echoed in his mind. Suddenly, his fear began to change shape. Instead of worrying about mistakes, he thought about the possibility of giving something to the people in that room, something real, something true. Even if they had asked him as a joke, he could turn the moment into something meaningful. His hands finally lifted. They hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, the room grew quiet. Conversations stopped, laughter faded, and every eye returned to him. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed to hush. The silence was heavy, but inside that silence, James found a strange comfort. He realized that everyone was waiting not for a janitor to fail, but for a man to take a chance. The hesitation was still there, clinging to him like a shadow, but now it no longer held him back. Instead, it reminded him of what was at stake. One key. That was all it would take to begin. He pressed it gently. A single note floated through the air, soft and pure. It lingered for a second, and the silence deepened as if the building itself was listening. James's shoulders relaxed just a little. But then doubt crept back. Could he really do this? Could he play after so many years? His fingers hovered again, unsure, frozen between fear and courage. The crowd still watched, their faces expectant. James's throat tightened, but then he smiled faintly to himself. He remembered how, when he was younger, he used to get nervous before playing in church. His mother always told him, "Close your eyes, James. Don't look at the people. Play like you're talking to God. Play like the music is bigger than you." So he did just that. He closed his eyes. The people, the room, the pressure, they all faded away. In his mind, he was back at the small church, the sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, the scent of old wood and hymn books around him. He was no longer the janitor in a crowded lobby. He was the boy with a gift, sitting at a piano that had always been his friend. The hesitation softened. His fingers finally touched the keys with purpose. The first few chords were gentle, almost uncertain, but they carried a warmth that filled the lobby. The notes connected together like a story, and James began to breathe easier with every sound. The crowd grew still. The laughter and whispers stopped. The joking mood that had begun the moment melted away. Something in the music pulled at their attention. Even those who had been glancing at their phones slowly lifted their eyes. For James, the hesitation was not gone completely, but it had changed. It was no longer fear of failure, it was respect for the music, a reminder of how important this moment really was. Every note he played carried the weight of years of silence, of all the times he had held back. Now, the piano gave him a voice again. And as his hands began to move more freely, he realized something powerful: the people watching weren't his judges. They were his audience. And an audience, no matter who they are, deserves honesty. So he kept playing. Each chord grew stronger, each melody clearer. His hesitation slowly faded into the background, replaced by something far greater: confidence. What had begun as a joke, as a casual suggestion, was turning into the beginning of something unforgettable. The first notes floated into the air like soft ripples spreading across still water. James's hands moved slowly at first, as if testing the piano, making sure it still remembered him the way he remembered it. The keys were slightly dusty, the sound not as polished as a concert hall instrument, but to James, they felt alive. Each touch unlocked memories, each chord tugged at places deep inside his heart. The people in the lobby leaned in closer. The laughter that had filled the room only moments ago had vanished completely. No one dared to interrupt. Something about the way James's fingers touched the keys told them this wasn't going to be a simple tune or a clumsy attempt. There was care in his movements, as if he was speaking a language that had been waiting years to be heard. With his eyes closed, James let himself drift into the music. He didn't think about the faces watching him or the doubts that had held him back. Instead, he thought about his mother humming in the kitchen, about the church choir that used to sing while he played, about the quiet nights when music was his only friend. Those memories poured out through his fingers, shaping each note into something warm, soulful, and true. The melody grew richer. His right hand carried the tune, gentle but clear, while his left hand built a deep harmony that made the sound fuller, more powerful. The room seemed to transform. The marble floor, the tall glass windows, the office decorations, suddenly none of it mattered. What mattered was the story James was telling through the piano, a story without words but filled with meaning. People who had been standing casually with drinks in their hands now found themselves frozen in place. A woman near the front lowered her cup slowly, forgetting to take a sip. A young man who had been smiling playfully before now watched with wide eyes, his expression softening into awe. Even the CEO at the back, who rarely showed much emotion in front of employees, leaned forward slightly, his face caught in the spell of the music. The notes rose higher, brighter, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Then they sank lower, slower, like a quiet evening when the world feels heavy. James played with such emotion that it seemed as though the piano itself was breathing with him, sometimes whispering, sometimes crying out, sometimes laughing with joy. James had not practiced for this. He had no sheet music in front of him. Everything came from memory, from his heart, from the years of silence that had built up like a river behind a dam. Now, that dam had broken, and the music poured out freely. For a moment, James opened his eyes. He saw the faces in front of him, silent, still, captivated. It startled him. He had expected smiles or laughter, maybe polite claps, but what he saw instead was respect. Real, honest respect. Some people had their mouths slightly open, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. One woman had tears forming in her eyes. The sight almost made James falter, but instead it gave him strength. He closed his eyes again and let the music swell. His fingers moved faster now, flowing across the keys like water rushing down a stream. He played a piece that wasn't written down anywhere. It was part memory, part imagination. It was his soul speaking in the only way it truly knew how. Every rise and fall of the melody seemed to carry a hidden message. To some, it sounded like hope. To others, it sounded like longing. For James, it was both. It was the story of dreams set aside, of sacrifices made, of talent hidden in the shadows, and of a moment that finally arrived when he least expected it. The lobby felt different now. It was as if time had slowed down. Even the workers who had been skeptical at first now stood still, their expressions soft and thoughtful. Phones lowered. Conversations stopped. The only sound was the piano, filling the air with something more powerful than words. And then it happened, the shift. The music reached a point where it grew so deep, so moving, that it touched something inside the listeners that they didn't know was waiting. It was no longer just background music, it was a message. A reminder that beauty can come from the most unexpected places, that greatness can live quietly in people you pass every day without noticing. James's body swayed gently with the rhythm. His head tilted slightly as his hands danced across the keys. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a janitor in a corporate building. He felt like who he truly was, a musician. A man with a gift. A man with something to give. The crowd could feel it too. A hush had fallen so deeply that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. People weren't just hearing the music, they were feeling it. Some felt it in their hearts, others in their memories. One man thought of his own father, long gone, who used to play the harmonica on summer nights. A woman thought of her childhood, listening to her grandmother sing lullabies. Everyone, in their own way, was pulled into the music's embrace. As James reached the heart of his piece, the sound grew bigger, bolder. His fingers moved faster than anyone expected. The piano, old and unused for years, now rang with life, filling every corner of the room with a sound that seemed almost impossible. People exchanged glances of disbelief, shaking their heads slightly as if to say, "How did we never know this?" Even the CEO, a man known for his strictness and calm demeanor, felt something stir in him. His eyes softened. He thought about his own long career, about the sacrifices he had made, about the times he had overlooked people like James because he assumed their roles defined their worth. And now here was James, the janitor, showing a depth that silenced the entire company. James didn't know what they were thinking. He didn't need to. He was too lost in the music, too caught in the river of sound that flowed through him. His hesitation from earlier was gone now, completely gone. The fear had melted away, replaced by a peace so strong it felt like coming home. Finally, the peace began to soften again. The storm of sound calmed into a gentle rain, each note falling like a drop of water, soft and steady. His fingers slowed, his body relaxed. The melody came to its natural end, fading into silence like the last light of day disappearing behind the horizon. When the final note lingered and died away, James kept his hands on the keys for just a moment longer. His eyes remained closed. He breathed in slowly, then exhaled, as though he had just poured out his entire soul and needed a second to gather himself again. The room was silent. Completely silent. Not because they didn't want to clap, but because they couldn't yet. They were still caught in the spell, still holding on to the last echoes of the music. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the entire building had paused to honor what they had just heard. And in that silence, James realized something: this was not a joke. This was not entertainment. This was a revelation for him, and for them. The last note lingered in the air like a breath held too long. Then it faded, leaving behind a silence so deep that even the smallest sound could have broken it. But no one moved. No one even dared to shift in their seat or whisper. It was as though the entire room was frozen, still caught in the glow of the music James had just given them. James slowly lifted his hands from the keys. For a moment, he let them rest on his lap, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady his breathing. He kept his head bowed, almost afraid to look up. He didn't know what he would see: laughter, pity, maybe even confusion. He had given them everything he had, but he wasn't sure if it was enough. Then it happened. Someone clapped just once, a single sound echoing across the lobby. Then another joined in, then another, until the whole room erupted in applause. It wasn't polite, half-hearted clapping, the kind given at the end of a speech. It was thunderous, rising from every corner, filling the space with a new kind of music one made not of notes, but of appreciation, surprise, and respect. James blinked in disbelief. His hands shook slightly. He had not expected this. He had thought, at most, they would smile kindly and go back to their conversations. But instead, they were standing now. Yes, standing. One by one, employees who had once passed him in the halls without a glance were rising to their feet, clapping with energy and admiration. The sound grew louder, stronger, until it felt as though the very walls of the building were vibrating with it. A few people whistled softly, others shouted bravo, as though they were in a concert hall instead of a corporate lobby. James looked up at last, his eyes wide. What he saw made his throat tighten. The woman who had been holding back tears earlier now had them streaming down her cheeks openly. She wasn't ashamed, she was smiling through them, clapping harder than anyone. A young man near the front wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed, but unable to hide his emotion. Even the CEO at the back, a man known for keeping his feelings locked away, had tears glistening as he brought his hands together slowly, firmly, with deep respect. James's heart swelled. He hadn't meant to make anyone cry. He hadn't even thought about moving people this deeply. He had just wanted to share the music inside him, the music he had hidden for so many years. And yet here it was, his story told through sound, reaching hearts in ways words never could. The applause went on and on. James felt his face grow warm, not with embarrassment this time, but with a humble pride. He stood slowly, his knees a little shaky, and gave a small nod to the audience. He didn't bow dramatically like a trained performer. He just nodded, with the quiet dignity of a man who had finally been seen for who he truly was. One by one, employees approached him. A young woman, barely out of college, said softly, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." "Thank you." Another man, older, placed a hand on James's shoulder and whispered, "You reminded me of my father. He used to play like that. I haven't thought of him in years." The words washed over James, each one a gift. He realized that his music had not only surprised them, it had touched something personal in each person. It had awakened memories, feelings, and truths that had been hidden away in their busy lives. The CEO stepped forward at last. The crowd grew quiet as he approached. He was a tall man with sharp features, the kind of leader who rarely showed softness in public. But now his expression was different. His eyes were glassy, his jaw tense as if holding back more emotion than he wanted to reveal. He extended his hand to James. For a second, James hesitated, unsure if he should accept it. But then he placed his rough, calloused hand in the CEO's polished one. The CEO gripped it firmly, then said, in a voice thick with sincerity, "James, that was extraordinary. You didn't just play music. You gave us something we'll never forget." James swallowed hard. He nodded, unable to find words. He had never imagined a moment like this, standing in the lobby, the center of attention, shaking hands with the CEO not as a janitor, but as an artist. The employees surrounded him now, asking questions, praising him, sharing their own feelings. Some wanted to know where he had learned. Others asked if he could play again someday. James answered as best he could, his voice soft but steady. I just grew up with music. It's always been a part of me." For the first time in years, James felt something shift inside him. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just the man pushing the mop in the corner, the one people barely noticed. He was James the musician, the man who could make even the busiest worker pause and feel, the man who could bring tears to the eyes of a CEO. The piano sat quietly behind him now, but it no longer looked like a forgotten decoration. It looked like a stage, a place where something important had happened. And everyone in the room knew they had witnessed something rare, something that went beyond entertainment. The rest of the gathering never returned to the way it had been before. Snacks and drinks sat untouched. Conversations shifted completely. People weren't talking about their weekend plans or their projects anymore. They were talking about James. About the music. About how they felt. In a way, James's performance had not just changed how they saw him, it had changed how they saw each other. They realized that everyone around them might carry hidden talents, hidden stories, hidden depths waiting to be discovered. The office suddenly felt less like a place of numbers and deadlines, and more like a place filled with human beings, each with a heart, each with something to give. For James, the applause was unforgettable, but it was more than just applause. It was recognition. It was a reminder that the gift he thought had been buried under years of silence still had the power to shine, to matter, to make a difference. As the clapping finally slowed, James sat back down on the bench, his heart still racing. He placed his hands gently on the piano once more, not to play, but just to feel it. He smiled quietly to himself. He had always believed his music was something private, something meant only for himself. But now he knew the truth: music, like light, is meant to be shared. And sometimes, it takes only one chance moment, one unexpected invitation to reveal it. That day, James had not just played the piano. He had opened a door. And in doing so, he had touched every soul in that room. The lobby eventually returned to its usual quiet, but something had changed forever. The piano, once ignored and dusty, now stood proudly at the center of the room as if it had been waiting all these years for James to bring it back to life. The applause had faded, but its echo still lingered in everyone's hearts. People went back to their desks that day, but their minds were elsewhere. The sound of James's music followed them, clinging to their thoughts like a soft melody that refused to leave. For James, the moment felt unreal. As he pushed his cart down the hallway later that evening, people stopped him not to hand him trash or ask for supplies, but to thank him. Some shook his hand warmly. Others smiled at him with a kindness he had never experienced in this building before. A young intern told him, "You made me call my mom. I hadn't spoken to her in months. Your music reminded me of her singing." James's eyes softened at that. He nodded, not knowing what to say, but deeply touched. The next morning, something unusual happened. When James walked in through the glass doors carrying his lunchbox and thermos, people actually greeted him. "Good morning, James," one said cheerfully. Another gave him a small wave. The receptionist, who had always been polite but distant, beamed at him as though he were an old friend. James wasn't used to this sudden attention. He smiled shyly, nodding in return. Word of what had happened in the lobby spread quickly through the company. By lunchtime, employees were still talking about it. "Did you hear him play? I had no idea. He should be performing on a stage somewhere, not mopping floors." Their voices carried not mockery, but admiration. Even the CEO called James into his office. The request startled him. He had never been summoned to the CEO's office before. James walked in nervously, his hands wringing together, unsure if he was in trouble. But the CEO stood up from behind his desk, came forward, and shook James's hand once again. "James," the CEO said in a voice filled with warmth, "what you gave us yesterday was a gift. You reminded us that there's more to life than work and deadlines. You reminded us of beauty, of heart, of humanity. I want you to know that we are grateful." James's throat tightened. He nodded slowly, humbled. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted to share a piece of myself." The CEO smiled. "And we want to hear more of it. From now on, I'd like you to play at our company gatherings. Not as a janitor, but as a musician. Would you do that for us?" James's eyes widened. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered, "Yes, sir. I'd be honored." From that day forward, James's life inside the building changed. He still did his work with the same dedication, cleaning floors, emptying bins, polishing windows, but now people didn't just see him as the janitor. They saw him as James, the man with music in his hands. They stopped to chat with him, to ask about his favorite songs, to share stories about their own hidden talents. On Fridays, when the office was winding down, someone would often say, "James, will you play us something before we leave?" And James, smiling shyly, would sit at the piano in the lobby and let his fingers tell another story. Employees would gather around, some standing, some sitting on the stairs, listening quietly as the week's stress melted away in the sound of his music. For James, it was more than just applause or recognition. It was healing. For years he had believed that his music didn't matter anymore, that it belonged to a past he had left behind. But now he understood it had always mattered. Even when no one was listening, even when he played alone at night, the music had been shaping him, waiting for the right moment to be shared. The piano also changed in the eyes of the company. It was no longer just a piece of furniture in the lobby. It became a symbol. People began to look at it with respect, knowing that it carried stories within it. Sometimes, after hearing James play, employees felt inspired to share their own gifts. Someone brought a guitar one day, another recited poetry, another sang softly while James accompanied them on the keys. The building slowly transformed from a place of only work into a place of connection, creativity, and shared humanity. Outside of work, James also noticed a difference. Neighbors who had heard about his performance asked him to play at community events. Local churches invited him to join their choirs. Even a small cafe owner asked if he could play on weekends to bring music to the customers. At first, James was overwhelmed, but then he realized how deeply people needed the gift he carried. But for James, it was never about fame or attention. He didn't dream of bright lights or big stages anymore. What mattered to him was the way people's faces softened when they listened, the way their eyes closed as though they were transported somewhere far away. What mattered was the way music connected hearts, sometimes without a single word spoken. The employees, too, never forgot the day the janitor sat at the piano. It became a story they told to new hires: "You think you know this place, but wait until you hear James play." Some called it the day the building discovered its soul. And James? He never stopped being humble. He never boasted about what he could do. He never asked for praise. He simply played when asked, cleaned when needed, and lived each day with quiet gratitude. But inside, he carried a new confidence, a quiet certainty that his life had meaning beyond what anyone had ever assumed. Years later, when people looked back on their time at the company, they didn't always remember every project or meeting. But they remembered James. They remembered the janitor who once sat down at a dusty piano and filled the room with music so powerful it brought tears to the eyes of the CEO. It wasn't just about music. It was about the lesson James taught them all, that greatness can live in the most ordinary places, that every person carries a hidden story, and that sometimes the simplest act, sitting down at a piano, can change the way people see the world. James never forgot that day either. To him, it was proof that no gift, no matter how long it is hidden, ever truly disappears. It waits patiently, like a seed under the soil, until the right moment comes. And when it does, it blooms, not just for the one who carries it, but for everyone who is lucky enough to witness it. That day in the lobby, James's music had not only filled the air. It had filled hearts. And long after the last note faded, the song continued living on in memories, in conversations, and in the quiet inspiration that reminded people to look more closely at those around them. Because you never know, behind a mop, behind a desk, behind a uniform, there might be a hidden gift waiting to be heard.